Thank you, Michelle. Derek?
Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Michelle. The premise of this panel and the premise of this day is about looking forward. But in this book that I've written with Jim Goldgeier, we believe that when it comes to thinking about grand strategy and thinking about America's role in the world, we can learn a lot by looking back. And the premise of this book very much shares the premise of the report that Michelle and my colleagues have put out, which is that while 9/11 will always be an important date for America and a date that we should always honor and remember, when it comes to the underlying dynamics of the world and America's role in it, 9/11 did not change everything. And that, in fact, the more important date is the mirror date of 9/11, 11/9, November 9th, 1989, and the fall of the Berlin Walls that signaled the end of the Cold War. And the story of America between the wars, which is between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the War on Terror, is about the struggle to define America's role in the world after the Cold War. And these are the issues that we are dealing with today as we try to sort out the strategic priorities that the next president should take in 2009. Now, this is about foreign policy ideas and concepts, but it's also about the politics of foreign policy. And that's what I thought I'd talk a little bit about this morning. Now, what we set out to do in this book is tell the story of the interaction between foreign policy debates among policy experts like everyone in this room and the political debates both within and between liberals and conservatives. And our contention is that one really cannot understand the political decisions and arguments about America's grand strategy since 9/11 or the choices in the future without understanding what transpired in these modern interwar years. Now let's start with the conservatives. Now it's no secret that the Republican brand has been diminished recently, and that fissures are opening among conservatives as they debate grand strategy for the post-Bush years. Now the fissures aren't new. In many ways these are the same fissures that emerged with the end of the Cold War almost 20 years ago. Anti-communism had been the glue that had held conservatives together for decades. And many Republicans argued after the Cold War that the United States could just become a normal country, or others, of course, turned more isolationist. Now, it's fair to say that the mood among a majority of conservatives during the 1990s was not one that was conducive to sort of thinking about engaging in the world. Now, partly this was an anti-Clinton phenomenon, but it was also a dispute about ideas. And I think on this score, my fellow panelist Bill Kristol and his colleagues deserve credit for pushing conservatives during the 1990s to think about internationalism and strategy. With all the ink spilled recently about neoconservatives, it's often hard to remember that, it wasn't so long ago, it was in the mid-90s, that neoconservatism was seen as a spent force. And there were only a few folks on the conservative side who were really pushing conservatives to grapple with the changing global landscape. Now, I think 9/11 created an illusion that conservatives were united again around the War on Terror. But I think the divisions of the 1990s have reemerged and are reemerging. More are questioning the future of the so-called freedom agenda. There's a resurgence of sort of realism on the right. And in some ways we're seeing a return, even in the current administration, of the policies that many conservatives once derided as sort of Clintonian and ad hoc. And I think particularly turnarounds in Iran and North Korea exemplify this. Now, this just isn't a struggle for conservatives. I mean, as liberals consider grand strategy, they're also facing challenges that stem from 11/9 and the legacy of the 1990s. For Democrats, the end of the Cold War was seen as an opportunity. It was an opportunity to put behind them the bitter struggles that had so divided liberals in the wake of Vietnam and the perception of being weak on communism. And, in 1992, the Clinton team saw the end of the Cold War as an opportunity to reunify liberals around a bold grand strategy for America and the world. Now, Clinton was largely successful. I think he had some difficult first years in office, but by the time he left the presidency in 2001, he had pushed the party to the center on foreign policy by championing globalization, especially for free trade, by standing up for democracy promotion, by promoting the idea that America was an indispensable nation, and that no major challenge could be solved without active American engagement. And, of course, in using military force in Bosnia and Kosovo and Iraq. So in this sense, there was a Clinton consensus among liberals on national security strategy in 2001. And in many ways, this was exemplified by the 2000 ticket with Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. Now, given the history of the past 7 years, liberals are questioning many of these ideas, and already we've witnessed tremendous pressure on Democratic candidates to repudiate NAFTA and the global trade agenda. Among many liberals, the idea of democracy promotion is seen as radioactive. The idea of America as an indispensable or sort of exemplar nation is seen as overly arrogant. And there's no doubt that Iraq's legacy will influence future debates that liberals have about the use of force. I think Secretary Albright has an excellent piece in the New York Times today on this subject. So the bottom line is that as we think about the future of grand strategy, we must keep in mind the journey that conservatives and liberals have traveled since the fall of the wall, and how the politics might play out in the years to come. Now let me close on a final note about doctrine. Now history since 11/9 is about the struggle to find the replacement for containment, right? Everyone wanted to be the next George Kennan. Now in the 1990s, President Clinton was desperate to outline what he described as a theory of the case. And he believed that the American people needed a simple notion, a kind of bumper sticker, to make sense of the rapidly changing world. And he was deeply frustrated that he was unable to find one, and he was constantly complained to his aides privately about his failure to do so. Now, eventually, the Clinton team came to embrace the view that actions mattered more than words. It's interesting. Towards the end of his term, when the U.S. went to war in Kosovo, Clinton officials constantly rebuffed efforts by the press and outsiders to articulate what was happening in Kosovo as a kind of Clinton doctrine. In fact, inside the administration, I can speak to this because I heard it firsthand in the administration, doctrine was referred to as the D word. And some foreign policy thinkers, especially conservatives, believe that the purposeful avoidance of articulating doctrine was in fact a sign of indecision and weakness. They argued that liberals didn't know what they were doing even when they did something right. And when the Bush administration entered office 7 years ago, they had embraced a narrative that Clinton had squandered U.S. influence because he never could define a clear strategic framework to guide policy. Now, Bush thought he found it with the war on terror. Now that idea is increasingly questioned as too narrow a frame through which to view American policy. So for all of us, this history should be a cautionary tale. I mean, of course, ideas are important, as are lofty goals. The president should articulate a set of principles that would help guide the country's policies. But solving problems is more important than laying out all-encompassing, simplistic, doctrinal pronouncements. Now, appropriately enough, the person who understood this better than probably anybody else at the time, and the dangers of trying to reduce a complex world into a single phrase, was the man so many foreign policy thinkers wanted to emulate, George Kennan. During the Cold War, of course, Kennan was deeply frustrated by the ways containment was used to justify many policies that he thought were ill-advised. It's interesting, in the early 1990s, as the Clinton administration was struggling to come up with its version of containment, the Clinton team met with George Kennan. He came down from Princeton. He was 90 years old at the time, and they wanted to hear sort of what the sage of strategy could help them come up with, and to replace the concept for the one that he had coined. And the former diplomat's wise advice was, don't try to boil it down into a bumper sticker. Come up with a thoughtful paragraph or two. Thanks a lot.
Now to